Serious, what's your story of seeing somebody's mental state degrade? My mother had cancer, and at the very end, maybe the last 2 weeks, there was a very rapid deterioration of her mental state. At first she'd say something a little off, like she had a couple of seizures, and I think she heard something about a Mediterranean cruise on TV. So she suddenly said, I have the Mediterranean shakes. It goes like this, and she kinda moved her arms in a shimmy. After a few seconds she went, Jesus, I'm losing my marbles, and we all, me, her, my sister, and my father, had kind of a sad laugh together. Little things like that went on for like a week. Then she started talking to people and commenting on things that weren't there. But she knew her mind was playing tricks on her. I remember my uncle, her brother, came up from Florida to say goodbye, and it took her a few minutes to realize she wasn't imagining him. She died a few of days later. Those were 2 very hard weeks for 15-year-old me, especially because on her 49th birthday just 5 weeks prior she seemed perfectly healthy. I of course knew she had cancer, but it seemed like she would pull through. Man, I haven't thought about that in a while. That was hard to write. My mom deteriorated pretty quickly at the end too. Metastatic. Everywhere cancer, really. She would trail off in stories she'd told many times because she couldn't remember anymore or forget words in the middle of a sentence. It seemed like she was aware of it sometimes, but not at others. She got very scared of things she couldn't put into words and started talking about seeing her mom, who died almost 30 years ago, in our house. 2 days before she died she was asking my aunt what she was having for dinner, and the next day she stopped communicating. The last thing I heard her say was I don't know when I asked her where she was hurting, and she died the next morning. My mom was a very talkative person, so hearing her get quiet was the biggest sign in some ways. She was 63. I watched a friend get overtaken by his first bipolar episode in about 3 weeks. He started smoking a lot more weed than he had before. He was on Snapchat and social media non-stop. He started drinking heavily as well, and barely sleeping. He totaled his Jeep and got a DUI. He went to his job and told his boss to duck off, among other things. He was fired. He started getting angry very easily. During this time I spoke to his mom to let her know what was going on, but she was in denial still. The drinking and mania continued for another week. He went golfing with some friends, and as they were driving home, he lost it and started ripping his clothes off and tried to jump out of the car. They pulled over and he was screaming for someone to come and kill him. They calmed him down enough to get to the hospital, where he stayed for a few days. This all happened in 3 weeks. He's better now, which is really good to see. I'm bipolar, can relate. My cycles are much slower. I usually have 3-month manias and 3-month depressions. The manias are great, to be honest. I have a euphoric feeling of loving myself and so much energy I can bounce off the walls. The depressions though are so dark, so much raw emotional pain. Every waking minute is used thinking of the most effective way to end myself. I always know when the lows are coming because I have a week-long migraine during the switch. Brains are fascinating, aren't they? Anyway, I'm on some pretty good meds now, so those days are past, I hope. My cousin has schizophrenia. When I was a kid I remember him being completely normal, then he joined the Navy and apparently got bullied a duck ton. When he came back he was 100% different. He would just stare into nothingness. He didn't say anything. Sometimes he'd laugh, but he wouldn't smile while doing it, and it'd be so dry and robotic. Heh heh heh. He totally broke down. Does he have medicine? My mom has a brain tumor since I was barely able to make my own memories. It's so deep in the brain that it can't be removed. I witnessed firsthand the devastation of what failed surgeries can do. Although the tumor is benign, it presses her brain and it creates a liquid that affects other areas, causing epilepsy and other side effects. She's basically a toddler now that although she can sometimes remember me, she can't take care of herself at all. She degraded over the years, but I don't have memories of a healthy and capable mother. My early memories involved visiting her in the hospital. Edit. Thanks for all the support and the awards, guys. This happened when I was really young, so while objectively it's sad, I'm not grieving. It was just a reality I had to grow up with. There was other stuff going on in my family, so I never grew attached to my biological mother. She's now in good care in an institution of sorts with therapists and doctors. This is perhaps the saddest one. Not only because you never got the chance to meet your real mum, but she also never got a chance to raise her child. Grandma. She had Alzheimer's and dementia. She started losing her memory slowly over time. Then one day she fell and broke her hip. Being bedridden accelerated her illnesses, and within couple of months she was just laying there and staring at the roof, barely speaking, and all she says is nonsense. She doesn't recognize anyone, not even her children. It's like she's not there anymore and all that's left is her body. The sad part is that she's been like that for years, dead but not really dead, that we can't even mourn her, probably because all the sadness and tears were shed while her body still lies on her bed. I remember that. For my grandmother it wasn't the hip, it was the flu. She got pneumonia and the next 3 years were skimming death and Alzheimer's. I still remember her last moments. She was a smoker, and her doc was sure she had cancer. Wasn't worth testing though. Her one good kidney was failing again, the pneumonia came back, she fell a bit beforehand, so her body was still recoiling from that, and the Alzheimer's accelerated. The lung cancer was just another line on the medical clipboard. I was there when she got her last rites. My father and I squeezed her hand, and we got a call at 10 p.m. that night that she died. It's brutal seeing your family as a husk. There's no words to express the pain, but I hope you and your family know it's okay to feel that pain. Bless her heart, and I hope that she peace soon. There's no prison worse than a broken body and mind. Watched my dad join a cult, get diagnosed with cancer, get dumped by the cult and die alone. It was horrible. One of his friends used the word sick as in ill, and that really made so many of his choices clear. He was dying. He felt like jizz. He didn't want to get medical care. He became mentally unstable and ended up pushing everyone away over 9 years. He got his wish. He died alone. This is so sad. My college roommate, after she was raped. I met her junior year when she was randomly assigned as my roommate. Through the year, we became close. She was this happy, jolly girl that never failed to make me laugh. I'm not kidding. Sometimes I would have an asthma attack from laughing so hard. I taught her how to drive on my car, and over the times we became really close, so I decided to live with her the following year. Except, the girl who came back from summer break just wasn't her. Till this day, I miss who she used to be. I miss the times we had. I miss her. We moved in, and things seemed to get weird. She stopped sleeping at night. She would do laundry at weird points in the night. She started waking me up in the middle of the night asking if I heard the voice or saw the shadow pass by. For the record, she never drank or used recreational drugs. Upon asking, she would say she was just tired. About 2 months in, I overheard her crying on the phone, and she came to me to tell the truth. She was raped by someone from church back home, a pretty famous / controversial church actually, that I'd rather not name. She was talking to her family on speakerphone. I heard her dad say, "You need to move on already," and her brother basically said, "I don't even think that ever happened." Her co-worker told her that she must have been asking for it or provoked the guy in same way. Basically everyone around her dismissed her or made her feel worse for even telling her truth. She shut down. She stopped talking to anyone, only me, sometimes. I distinctly remember her saying multiple times, / my name. Sometimes I think people's reaction to my truth makes me feel worse than the actual rape. Her mental health quickly deteriorated after that. She stopped leaving the apartment. She would order food under fake names and sometimes under my name. She stopped going to work or class. She became a paranoid person and just thought that those people from church would get her. She just shut down. She admitted that she had locked herself in the bathroom a few times with a knife. I did report it to the college authorities and try to help her. I remember sitting on her bed with her late nights and just let her cry and talk to me. It used to pain me so much because I couldn't do anything except just be there for her. I blamed myself for a really long time for not being able to do something more. Then she disappeared. She packed her bags, dropped out of college, and just left. I tried to reach out to her, but all these years, never heard from her. I never forgot about her. She had worked so hard, took loans, came from a very poor background, as in sometimes she would have a potato for dinner or share my dinner with me, worked multiple jobs, and had made it all the way to 4th year in a prestige university. She came from a really bad background and wanted to just make it through college. Most people in her family never even made it through high school, so she would be the first to not just attend, but graduate from college. She had this dream of being a college graduate and working as a translator in the government somewhere. If only she had the right help, the right people, the right support system, maybe she might have made it. Edit, spelling plus add more information to clarify a few questions people had. Second edit, I'd rather not name the church or further identify her. I don't think it's relevant to the story. That's really sad. Shame on her family for not supporting her. Your support system can really determine how you recover from abuse, and they can sometimes be worse than the actual abuser. My fiance's mom passed a few years ago from Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, CJD for short. CJD is most commonly called mad cow disease, even though they aren't the same. CJD only happens to humans and mad cow is bovine. CJD is when these proteins in your brain, called prions, go crazy and start to fold and basically turns your brain into Swiss cheese. There is no cure and it is very rare. Only a few hundred cases a year. She was perfectly healthy except for being diabetic, but she had zero complications with her diabetes. Then out of nowhere she started having problems remembering things and then starting having mood swings. She went to the doctor, but they couldn't figure out what it was. It wasn't until a month or so later that a specialist diagnosed her with CJD. She went from being completely healthy to not being able to move her arms, legs, control voluntary and involuntary functions, and then death in 8 months. It was extremely hard on my fiance to see her mom lose everything that made her who she was. Her own mother and father had to see her deteriorate as well. I was just awful for the whole family. My grandfather died of CJD as well. I was away at college, so I didn't see his decline. But even when I had been home for Christmas, we could tell something wasn't right. His funeral was the week of my spring midterms, and I couldn't get home until the following week. I know how hard it was on my dad to see his father that way. When we came back from my deployment, I literally watched my then husband become a shell of the person he previously was. Prior to the deployment he was so light, optimistic, and social. He slowly transitioned into a man afraid to leave home and eventually began to use substances and was finally released from duty because of it. We still remain friends after all these years, but he's still only a ghost of the person he was before. I'm so sorry. This is awful to experience. At some point you have to accept that the person you loved is never mentally coming back. It's truly heart-wrenching. My own. I went from a happy 13 years old to being molested for 3 years, dropping out of school, becoming a drug addict dealer for 20 years, married then divorced. Wasn't till after that I got help, had some time in a hospital, got antidepressant medication then and only then realized I had been depressed and going downhill since the age of 13. 7 years later, been drug free for the whole 7 years. I'm off meds now and enjoy life. Thank you for sharing a happy ending. Needed this today. Not something I would want to describe in great detail, but got to witness what delayed onset PTSD can do to someone. I was aware that someone very important to me had gone through some shiz in adolescence, but they seemed incredibly okay with it when we met and grew close. However, another related event occurred that revealed that their awkness was a pretty thin crust over a ducking volcano of chiz. This person went from happy-go-lucky, bubbly, generally quite charmingly extroverted and largely functioning, to an absolute emotional wreck in the space of a few weeks, if that. Had to watch someone's psyche get gutted from the inside by something that happened nearly a decade ago, and had no idea how to even begin to help. The whole thing was incredibly grueling to witness, and I don't think I can even come close to imagining how it must have been to experience it. Over the course of the next 4 or 5 years though, I watched this same person basically rebuild themselves from the ground up, despite what seemed like constant relapses after even the tiniest progress. Can't overstate how much respect I have for them, and for the therapists that eventually helped them through it. Did they ever get back to that person? I'm in a similar situation, in the middle of reconstructing I've fundamentally changed as a person, but wonder how others experience it. A close person to me told that he had what he thought was a mental breakdown at the age of 5 or so, and the reason was intrusive thoughts about death, specifically his own death. I said, why would you even be thinking that at that age? And why would he worry about that? Because he was still a child and far from death. He just responded with, I don't know. It's like I know how it feels. It might have been just a one-time thing, but he had these mental breakdowns sometimes, and it was not good. The most recent bad one was when he was 15. He was doing something happy or anything, but then he suddenly freezes up, then flinches and starts to cry like a child. And he cries for hours and kicks his feet. At this point I was scared because he was inconsolable and don't know what to do. After a night's sleep, he seems to be fine, but he seems to have momentary aftershocks and would flinch and start to cry again. He said it takes 2 months to recover from this or be back to his normal happy self, but he becomes scared, frantic and sad in these 2 months. Worst thing is I think he kinda had PTSD from these episodes, and if something reminds him of these situations he breaks down again. One specific song was enough to make him have a mental breakdown, and it seems he is likely to have these in December or in the night. He's fine now and has ways to recover from the breakdowns, but it seems he is still prone to having these episodes. Has he seen a therapist or psychiatrist? Sounds similar to my husband, who wasn't diagnosed bipolar until he was 28 and had a manic episode with psychotic features triggered by being on Adderall. He also has PTSD and hears voices randomly. He handled it all surprisingly well on his own until it went too far. My mom is manic depressed. Most of my childhood she had it under control with the help of strong drugs. After my little sister was born, she gained a lot of weight and she had the idea to stop her medication in order to lose weight. After that, everything went downhill. She soon developed manic phases. Every day her mood changed. 1 day, depressed, constantly crying. 2 day, super happy and euphoric, would spend most of the money we had for the week. 3 day, regretful of her spendings and blaming it on us kids. 4 day, provoking towards us, begging us to hit her or break things, extremely aggressive, but would never hit us. Repeat. This went on for 2 years. My little sister was 4, I was 10 and my big sister was 12. We wouldn't have enough money for the month by the end of the first week. She would often cook everything from our pantry in the matter of 1 day, and the food would go to waste. She wouldn't bring my sister to daycare. I walked her to daycare, went to school and picked her up at the end of the day. That year, I learned how to cook, and I would steal money from her to go grocery shopping. It was the worst time of my life. You have to understand, before that, I never saw my mom being maniac. It was like someone killed my sweet, loving, caring mom and replaced her with a stranger. I cried every night. She finally started taking her drugs when my sister confessed to her that she was molested by our best friend's father. That year, we had spent a lot of our time with this family, so she blamed it on herself for not realizing sooner. 11 years later, and I'm so proud of my mom. She has her mental illness under control, takes amazing care of my little sister, and has raised us to be strong independent women. There's a tiny part of me that still doesn't trust my mom in her life choices or decision making, but I love her to death. Thank you for sharing your story. I hope it felt a bit therapeutic to get it all out. I'm happy for you and your mom. It sounds like she made a lot of progress. You should also be proud of all that you did for your family as a child and that you continue to do today. My parents got a divorce when I was 10 and my sister was 6, so she and I did a lot of chores and I made food for us when my mom worked late. It definitely helped me to mature and not take things for granted. I've become more independent and resilient. Sending all my best wishes your way for a safe and happy life wherever you are in this world. My group of friends witnessed 2 friends go through paranoid schizophrenic breakdowns, one after the other, in the space of 2 years. The second one was my roommate. It happened very suddenly. He just woke up one day and decided that we were all lying to him all the time, and acted with the hostility and contempt that you would expect from someone who thought those things. He did erratic stuff like smashing all his belongings with a baseball bat in the driveway and piling all his socks on the kitchen floor. He eventually went back to his parents' house, which was a relief. From what I have heard, he never really got the help he needed. My friend's brother is starting to show signs of schizophrenia, or maybe bipolar disorder. He was such a nice kid, but now has hyper paranoid, including accusing his mother of trying to poison him. Has fallen in with some new age Christian cult, and has become fanatical. His mood swings wildly, and he makes massive decisions at the drop of the hat, such as moving across the country without telling anyone, not even his father whom he lived with at the time. Just packed a suitcase and left. He believes COVID is a hoax created by the Jews, even though he was raised by a Jewish woman. It's just heartbreaking. Has clearly so ill but nothing can be done, because he doesn't pose a threat to anyone. Yet. But I'm terrified for their mom, who has living with now, because he got mean when he accused her of poisoning him. I don't know how long it's going to be before he concocts something else to blame on her and actually ends up attacking her. Me. Recently found out that it actually started a year before I thought it had. Being manic is a hell of a drug, I'll tell ya. I was a powerhouse during my junior year, but don't really remember my last 2 years of high school, sadly. Had a full-on mental breakdown the last semester of my senior year, till I got diagnosed bipolar. I was a shell of my previous self. Didn't eat, rarely went outside, didn't talk to my numerous friends. It was a hard time for my parents, seeing me deteriorate so completely. I mean, I went from being one of the most popular kids in my high school, to barely being able to get out of bed. My parents don't talk about it. Have you gotten better? Asking for my son, who has a similar story, and is still struggling to see progress. My half-brother started out life pretty well, spoiled absolutely rotten, and got anything he wanted. My mother had me when he was 16, and she's always said that was what started his downhill spiral, because he suddenly wasn't spoiled and the center of attention anymore. He barely graduated high school because he had played sports and was planning on going pro in baseball, but of course it never happened. My parents used their savings to send him to college, and he majored in tech, where he failed out of his class because he said the Asian kids were better and buried him. They bought him a car, he wrecked it. They bought him another car, he wrecked it. They bought him a third car, he let it rust out. With no real other prospects he joined the military, went to Iraq. He killed quite a few civilians, bragged about it a lot, sent me photos of the corpses. When he came back my mother begged him not to re-enlist, so he didn't, but he wanted to go back so bad because he didn't know what else to do. He knocked his girlfriend up, had my niece, became a cop to use his military skills. Our grandmother bought him a house. The house is now condemned because no one would clean, and it's covered in cat poop, dog poop, rat poop, cockroaches, etc. Imagine a house from hoarders and multiply that, and add a couple in their 30s with 2 young children. He got fired from the police force for misconduct, and now lives in his friend's apartment helping him grow weed in the bathroom. His wife left him, and he has custody of my niece who lives without internet, running water, a consistent food supply and a bathroom. He looks like a homeless man, and we can't even reach him because his phone was shut off. Edit. Perhaps I should have explained that I have tried to contact both the police in the area and CPS. However, I have had no luck with either. Despite the fact that my brother is technically homeless and living as though he is homeless with my niece, they have refused to do anything. I have tried to get him to at least let her visit so we can take care of her for periods, but in response he has confiscated her phone, so she cannot be in touch with us, and is monitoring her social media when she is allowed to view it. I love her very much, but I have done all I can do legally to try and get her in my home instead. Edit 2. To those saying get a lawyer, my mother actually is a lawyer and has been working on this situation. It is extremely difficult when you're working against your own son. However, emotionally, the weed he grows is legal in the state he's in. We've had difficulty contacting any of her teachers because of COVID, because instead of moving online they simply dismissed school. His ex is not a viable option for custody. She has extreme bipolar disorder that is barely medicated, and she tends to disappear for days or weeks on end, and has been known to use other drugs. She used to buy cocaine and weed from my dad, for God's sake. If your niece is without consistent food, running water, or a bathroom, I'm pretty sure this is neglect and it's absolutely something to contact CPS about. If you're uncertain about what steps to follow, you might also be able to get in contact with a guidance counselor at her school. They are mandatory reporters and should know the steps and might be able to take action a little easier if you don't live nearby. My mom was / is a schizophrenic. I haven't seen her in about 8 years at this point. She was in and out of my life a lot, as my dad would take her back. She'd start up on meds, stop taking them again, and everything would start over. She went from a normal almost soccer mom in my youth to a BPD / schizophrenic mess by the time I was 16. This leave / return process had a lot of side effects, horrible situations, police callings etc. But one situation stood out to me the most as the scariest thing she'd ever said to me. The last lucid thought she had. She always kept the pepper by the coffee pot, because if you put pepper flakes into coffee and something has been added to it, because she was worried about being poisoned, the pepper flakes disperse over the surface of the coffee very quickly. She demonstrated with dish soaps and oils, and even antifreeze a few times. At one point, I legitimately forgot why she kept the pepper by the coffee pot, across from the stove, instead of above the stove with the rest of the spices. So, I asked her. She responded with, "So that every time you grab the pepper from now on, you'll think about how I was before my mind went to choose." Immediately I asked what she meant, and her brain shut off, and she acted like she'd never said it. She vanished a few weeks later around Christmas 2013. I think she's living in Florida now. Still has a conspiracy theory Twitter and everything. Sending you internet hugs. I'm sorry. So I'm a nurse in an assisted living facility. Most people there have dementia. Of course I have plenty of stories of sundowners or hospice patients. However, this person just stuck with me. When I was an aide at a local hospital, there was a woman who came into a med-surg unit. She was middle-aged, so not old. I don't remember why she was on our unit, but I remember it had something to do with a car accident. But she was so smart. She had 2 doctorate degrees and enriched many lives at a local college. I just remember being in awe of the conversations I would have with her when I had the time. She was there for a long time. I remember saying goodbye to her at the end of the shift and her commenting that she was going to a rehab facility. A few months go by and she came back. I remember seeing her name and being excited to see her. When I went to her room she didn't recognize me, which wasn't too odd. Sometimes the regulars didn't recognize me. However, she didn't even know how to use the remote for the TV. She could still for the most part take care of herself with minimal help, but something was off. I told the nurse who had taken care of her the previous night about the status condition change, but the nurse didn't do anything. The next times I had her I just watched her decline. Become incontinent, unable to care for herself, mood swings, all of those. It was the saddest thing I had ever seen at that point in my career. She ended up palling in the hospital. I will never forget the intelligent strong woman I had met just months ago become almost a shell and nonverbal so quickly. I never saw a visitor there even once. I have a PhD in chemistry, and when I was in graduate school there was an emeritus professor who had severe Alzheimer's who would sometimes come in to visit with the older professors in the department. He got to the point he had to come in a wheelchair and didn't really understand what was going on. I say this not to brag on myself for going there, but because it's important to understand. This was / is one of the top 10 chemistry departments in the country. That means the professors there are among a handful of the best chemists in the world. My pi had known him for years and would shed tears when he would leave campus. Eventually he parted while I was still a student. It was a tragic day. Even the very best of brains are able to succumb to dementia. Friend fell back into addiction. I thought I felt powerless as I listened to him downplay his use. I felt even more useless as he started looking off into corners. Then said the voices that he was hearing weren't from meth, they were from living with his parents. While I was away, my BF went over to him holding a kitchen knife to keep his parents, who were half a world away on vacation, in the basement. He hid in a bench for 6 hours. Finally, he called the cops on his voices. Visited him every day I could in the mental ward. When he got out, he blew up our friendship, went missing, went back into the psych ward. That's the last thing I knew. 2 people who were close to me are addicted to meth. Just don't do meth. It's never going to turn out alright. The emotional turmoil you and your loved ones go through is not worth any drug. It's happening right now, and it's not fun to watch. My cell rang at 3 AM last night. It's my mother calling, asking if the tomato plants in the backyard have fruit. As I'm typing this, my phone is ringing and it's her. She is in the adjacent room and partially within my line of sight. People forget that Parkinson's just doesn't make you shake. It's muscle rigidity, muscle loss coupled with cognitive decline. Honestly, I don't know how people like Michael J. Fox manage to continually survive. It ain't money related. Because there is no magical drug cocktail that prevents it from getting worse. My grandpa was diagnosed with Parkinson's when I was a teenager. He died in 2018 and honestly it was relieving because it was so hard to watch him deteriorate. He was a very active man. Loved to be outside, loved playing volleyball, loved games, euchre, solitaire, dominoes, etc. As time passed he was no longer able to be active. He was a master at euchre. Nobody in my large Irish Catholic family could beat him, and I remember the sadness that fell over the whole family the first time he lost. The worst part was when the dementia got really bad and he couldn't remember, he wasn't able to do the things he wanted to. He fell several times because he would get up when my grandma or aunt left the room to grab something from the kitchen or whatever. He was also very stubborn and would fight and resist when anyone tried to stop him from doing what he wanted to do. He also lost his ability to talk, so it was hard for him to communicate with us. He could still whisper, but it was short snippets of sentences and often took a while to decipher. My godfather also had Parkinson's and died in 2018, but he also had cancer and some other health issues and deteriorated much quicker. It was still hard to watch, but not as heartbreaking. Parkinson's is hard, and it especially sucks, because like you said there is no cure, nothing that stops it from happening or getting worse. Once it's there, it's there. You just know what the outcome is going to be. It sucks. And it seems like it always happens to the best people, at least in my experience. I'm sorry you're having to go through that with your mom. My brother was always a little bit off. Most of the times, it was perceived as an effect of a serious medical condition he had as a child. He was intelligent, bright as hell, exceeding an academics field, so most of his weird mannerisms was written off, you know, beautiful mind/weird nerd kind of stuff. But there was something else that he kept hidden from his mother and our father. He was experimenting with anything psychoactive he could find, combining it with regular stoner stuff, lucid dreaming, meditating. He slowly disappeared from social life and became weirder and weirder to talk to. When we talked for the last time, he went on about being one with his astral plane and about how we should both escape to China, where chips implanted in our bodies will have no signal. He was taken to a mental institution about a week after that, diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, and released on his first leave after 3 months. As I was in our hometown at the time, I planned to visit him after he was released. We were set to meet on Saturday, but he died on Friday evening. I want to believe that in his last moments he aimed to finally become one with the astral world he created in his mind, and not a broken young man who came to realization that for his whole life he will have to fight with a severe illness. Took me about 2 years to finally make peace with what happened, but I guess I'll never forgive the medical professionals who had let him out for the leave. I'm so sorry for your loss. My grandfather had PTSD from Vietnam. In his final days, he was in a mental institution. They let him out and told us good luck. He took his life that night. I know how chilly that feeling is. I hope the best for you and your family. When I was in graduate school for psychology, my aunt and uncle called me over to their house because my cousin refused to get out of bed or go to work. When I got there I witnessed my cousin in his bed laughing at random statements he made, smiling in a bizarre way, and looking at me and saying lewd comments about sexual behavior and what he wanted to do with me. This was completely out of character. I told my aunt and uncle something was clearly not right, and I suggested we take him to a behavioral health center. They balked at the idea, insisting my cousin was just trying to get out of going to work. Meanwhile, my cousin gets out of bed and became agitated, shouting random sexual comments and saying he was going to beat everybody up. We called the paramedics and they had to restrain him and then took him to the behavioral health center. My cousin was placed in a locked holding area and he kicked the walls, jumped around, and yelled. It was hard to watch. The intern psychiatrist asked me several questions pertaining to my cousin's genes. My cousin was adopted and we didn't have any valid information. Anyway, his diagnosis ended up being schizoaffective disorder. Has never been the same. How can schizophrenia appear all of a sudden? What are the causes? This heavily involves psychedelics, but a friend went from being shy and not very talkative to very erratic with suicidal spouts and just eventually shutting themselves off. Wow, and here I was considering psychedelics to deal with my mental issues. I didn't realize they could make things so much worse like that. I watched my father steadily lose his mind after the passing of my mom. He seemed to go through every stage of grief apart from acceptance. 5 years of what appeared to be a heartbroken man was actually a schizophrenic one. The diagnosis, often triggered by a traumatic event, resulted in his denial. He claims he's well. I can confidently say, he is no longer the person I remember to be my dad. His voice is different, raspy from the constant shouting at auditorial hallucinations. He no longer smiles, laughs. He is always paranoid and furious. Although my story is about him, I've been more so affected by the people around him. Once his diagnosis was brought to light, various family members began to pity him, walk on eggshells around him, and the most bothersome, talk to him similar to that of a baby. He marches around demanding we acknowledge the fact that he is not retarded. I hope those reading this learn to treat others, especially those victims of losing a loved one, understand to treat them with dignity. My dad is not a broken person. He is a changed person, one still healing. I'm so sorry to hear about your dad and want to tell you how strong you are for dealing with it all. I used to date a man with schizophrenia and just treating them normal is all they want. It's so easy not to treat someone with dignity and not belittle them. All they need is a little extra understanding and patience. My grandmother was very ill for many years with almost no immune system. Minor cuts and scrapes would get infected and run rampant. Every now and then the infection would make its way to her brain. It would usually start slowly and progress to hallucinations. Commonly she would see mice or cockroaches. One time she believed fully that she had hair lice and would get her husband to check and comb her hair to the point it would start falling out. Eventually she'd have no idea of the date or even the year, sometimes believing it was as early as the 40s, the same year she was born. She'd then begin to forget how old people were, and at its worst, who they were. All this time she believed she was fine and refused to go to the hospital. Even after all that, the hardest was the vitriolic hateful things she would say to you and everyone else when the ambulances were called because she could barely stay conscious. These infections happened 4 or 5 times, maybe more. And every time the doctors would tell us that she wouldn't make it, and she did every time. She passed away in 2017. I'm so sorry for your loss. I'm glad you were able to distinguish that her spiteful moments were products of her mental decline and in no way meant for you as her family. When working clinicals in the hospital, my friend would always get stuck with the meanest people. Once she thought she had a sweet old lady. She was kind, compliant, and very easygoing with her morning meds. By lunchtime, she was convinced that she was dead, pulled her fourth out to prove so, and told my friend she was going to burn in hell with the rest of this hospital. It's almost comedic the things these people can say, but as nurses we are taught to just kinda nod and do our job to separate the person from the damaged mental function. I watched a friend learn that he inherited his dad's bipolar disorder. He then was unable to get accepted to college after HS due to him having low scores. He tried but had issues as his parents considered it a waste of time. He then attempted to get admitted again but was refused. He cut ties with all his friends that got into college including myself. Time went by and he went from job to job till he settled to work for his dad, which he really hated and disliked. It was a construction painter's job. He then started to study car mechanics and got in an car accident BC hadn't slept in a day. He worked plus studied as his parents forced him to pay rent. The accident left him slow and with memory issues as well as losing his permit, so he couldn't work anymore as he couldn't RWQCH the client's places, nor could he keep up with class. His matricity was also affected. He had to drop out and wait some time to reapply, but during that time to recovery his parents forced him to work under the table and he slowly became crazy. He sees no future he will enjoy. He cut everyone from his life. He's in debt BC of the car accident as he was 100% default. His parents tie him down and his dad lashes out on him. He became a smoker and struggles to form a real bond as everything about him pushes everyone away. He is also humiliated by his family for taking bipolar medication and therapy, and to this day he doesn't seem to see the light at the end of the tunnel. TLDR. Teenagerhood friend went from cheerful kiddo to depressed adult with no future. It's sad because such a person could be helped, but the people around him, intentionally or not, just choose not to. As a crisis social worker I've seen a lot, but the one that sticks with me is watching my aunt die of ALS. When she was diagnosed she was an energetic extrovert who loved to joke and entertain. Watching her lose her ability to communicate was painful because you just knew it was killing her too. She was 100% aware of what was happening to her. She stopped speaking because she couldn't, and then she lost the ability to write, and then she couldn't even follow a conversation around her. She just drooled. It was heartbreaking, and there was no coming back and nothing anyone could do. My mom had ALS. It's awful. Her mind was sharp the entire time. When she could no longer speak, we had this monitor that would track her eye movements and allow her to type. She got pneumonia and we were told she couldn't live without oxygen. Because of the mask she could no longer use her eyes to communicate. So taking the oxygen mask off was planned. Went to the hospital and then saw one tear running down her face right when I saw her. She knew as soon as the mask came off she was going to die. I really can't imagine how terrible that feels. When I was about 15 I made friends in high school with a girl I really liked. We got on great, spoke outside of school on MSN Messenger and spoke a lot when we had cleas together. She was very popular, very attractive and had a great sense of humor. One day she stopped turning up to school. No one knew why, and we couldn't get in contact with her. Eventually her form tutor told his students what was going on and that got around school. She was put in hospital with anorexia. She was allowed out on weekends and I would always go and see her when I could. She was still herself at this time, just struggling. Fast forward a few years she was still in and out of hospital and a lot worse now. Out once a month for home visits and I would see her then, and this is when I started to see her as a shell of a human being. She was no longer the girl I knew. She just seemed empty and not there. At one time we went to an amusement park together and she had to eat at very specific times. We had just come off a roller coaster and I didn't feel like eating at all, and because of this, she just broke down and even phoned her mom and told on me for not eating. We spoke a lot still over text and got very close. I always thought she would eventually get better and be able to live a normal life. We planned a future together, spoke about having kids and pets, etc. A few more years went by and she got even worse. She would always talk about not being able to do it anymore and how she had lost all her friends. We were never dating, but I eventually moved on and got another girlfriend. At the time the relationship was new and I didn't want anything to ruin it. I backed off from messaging how we used to. She reached out a few times after and I ignored her. Around a year ago she ended up committing suicide in hospital. When I first read about it, I was in shock. I didn't think it would affect me, but it did and still does. It constantly tears me up inside. Every time it's really sunny and nice outside I think how she will never feel the warmth on her skin again. Every milestone in my life I always think about how she will never get to experience this. She will never get to grow old. I don't think I could have stopped her, even if we were talking, but it would have been nice to be there for her, just so she had someone. Sometimes we need to look after ourselves and put some distance between ourselves and someone that is detrimental to our own mental health. It may sound incredibly selfish, but sometimes it can be really dangerous. Years of struggling to help someone that we honestly can't really help can itself lead to severe depression and other issues. It's a sad reality and it's incredibly complicated, but I honestly hope you're doing alright and that you'll find some peace. A coworker had her second child started banging rails of coke daily, awake for 4 days, sleep 4 torrents, and repeated took a turn for the worse when we found her getting ducked for coke money in our office after hours. Sober now, kids are okay, but this literally was a month-long endeavor, 20k up her nose. Postpartum chiz makes me so nervous to have kids. I remember someone posted on Reddit a while ago that his wife refused to use their baby's name and believed it was an alien replacement or something, and everyone was like, take her to the hospital right now. And it turns out she had postpartum psychosis because that's a thing. JFC. This got away bigger than I thought, and I appreciate all your posts. I've been reading through them all. Thank you for opening up and sharing your experiences. Thank you for making this post. When mom was 14, she came home from school one day to find her mom laying in bed. Dinner was started, but her mom was in bed. Lay beside me, wrap your arms around me. She held her mom, their hands clenched tight, as she died. Then she got up, sent her little brother to get daddy in the field. She finished preparing supper. Those kids had to have something to eat. A few years later, her baby sister was killed in an accident. The local preacher gave her a ride to church and took advantage of the opportunity. I don't know the details. My sister does. It's bad is all I know. The local madam made money available for her to go to college. An act of kindness. She always said her oldest brother and her dad gave her the money for school. They were poor dirt farmers. I didn't tell her. Years later, when I discovered where they got the funds, she got pregnant in a day when that was not done. So they got married, had 2 more, started careers. Then her husband got cancer and died in her arms as she held his hand. She was a 28-year-old widow with 3 kids. She remarried a guy she thought was a dreamer. They moved away from family support group to a remote area. He wasn't as much a dreamer as a crackpot, but she loved him. So she stood by as he treated her kids horribly. He was so harsh with her kids. They had another one. They moved all over the world. Then he was killed in a car accident. She remarried a 3rd time. By this time I was an adult. She ended up raising 4 of her own and 3 of his. Mom could cook a fancy meal for a bunch of strangers on short notice. She could design and build a house. She was an amazing nurse. She was the favorite aunt. She was a charming travel partner with her 3rd husband. She drove a hard bargain, was an incredible seamstress, and when all the kids were gone away, moved out of the house, she could relax. She finally lost it. Made no sense. Saw men in trees watching her through the windows. Paid private investigators to look for listening devices under the house, in the walls. She started driving. Drove her car all over the country with her big dog. Went to visit neighbors she had last seen 40 years before. Drove to corners of the country propelled by severe paranoia. Slept in her car. Kept coffee cans to pee in. A strange lady called me. Said that mom was with her. Obviously lost. Mom taught her how to bake bread. She had tricked mom into getting enough information to find me and call me and let me know where she was. Then mom drove off. One day she showed up at my house. We sat down to talk. She asked to use the restroom. She took a while. I went to check on her just in time to see her car driving away. 8 years mom lived on the road, bouncing around the country. She would settle in somewhere because she liked the flowers or because her dog seemed to like that stretch of road. I know of 2 houses she somehow bought during that time. One just sat empty. One night at 2 AM my sister got a call. Come get me. C's got to the intersection and mom's fingers were bleeding from chewing the nails. She tricked her to get in the car and drove to the hospital. Mom was in the psych ward a long time and finally settled down just in time to get the cancer diagnosis and go through that process. One late night in the hospital I asked her, "Mom, how did you get through all that shiz?" She looked at me. "What shiz? What are you talking about?" Cancer took its course. I held her as she died, hands clenched tight. Wow. This story was well executed and so hard to read at the same time. I hope you're well. Good for you for staying by her side, even in the final moments. I can think of 2. An old bank director of mine got diagnosed with some kind of brain cancer. I didn't see him too often since it happened after I graduated high school. So every interaction I had with him would be pretty few and far between. making the change I saw in him dramatic. I saw him after surgery with a scar around his bald head like Frankenstein's monster, but even then I hadn't quite grasped what kind of toll it took on him. He used to be the kind of guy that would just talk and talk during concerts. So much so he'd kind of catch himself going on too long about how great he thought we were. Then he had such a hard time just forming sentences. He became very easily confused and was quicker to anger. It's like, if I could think a mile, he could think 10 feet. Just enough to tell you what he needed. He passed away earlier this year and I'm still pretty shook up over it. The other was my grandpa. Growing up, he was always a quiet dude, never said too much, but he seemed to always have a smile on his face every time I looked at him. At some point, before I became a teenager, my grandma had a pretty serious injury and never really recovered. She spent maybe 5 years in a rehabilitation center about 45 minutes away from their home. My grandpa would drive to and from that RC every single day and stayed as long as they would let him. When she died from heart complications, I remember he sat there in the room with her for a few quiet moments. We could all see in his eyes that he had shut off. He told everyone, "I'm going home and putting on my pajamas." The dude got depressed, quit shaving, seldom left the house and his body and mind followed suit. He just got really spassy and had no clue what was happening or where he was. He died of a stroke almost 2 years to the day after his wife. But we all knew he died of a broken heart. My grandpa did this after my grandma left. He would sit quietly disengaged and then suddenly start talking about the doctors making a mistake and causing my grandma to pass away. He just couldn't wrap his head around it. He would say, "You know, I think I figured it. I think that doctor gave Nita the wrong medicine." 2 years of him just waiting to be with her again. I've witnessed the mental decline of a couple people in my life, but for some reason, lately, the one that sticks with me is Amanda Bynes. She was such a spunky, charismatic, energetic kid/young adult that, or she was a good actress. But ever since her tweets to Drake, and then her internet hiatus, to her recent resurface, she just looks like a shell. If you look at her Instagram, it looks like she is reading from a script. She is apparently a couple years sober, which is great, but she still seems so off. It's really sad. I seriously think she was sexually abused while on Nickelodeon. There's been lots coming out about Dunskneder and his foot fetishes, but I really think something bad happened to her. She spiraled hard and a lot of her actions are consistent with someone who went through an extremely traumatic experience. I dated a girl that was very much into her sorority in college. She was good looking, in the top business program, came from an affluent family, was loving, and just fun to be around. She convinced me to dabble into some hallucinogens one semester, which was fun, but after I found what I was looking for in them, I lost interest in the drug, but she did not. Some of the fog kind of cleared from my head, and I realized my ex was extremely manipulative and controlling and I needed to get further. The breakup ended terribly and resulted in pages upon pages of letters basically convincing me she was God and that she could save my lost soul. Then her letters turned cruel, so I cut off contact with her and all of our friends and moved across the country. I hadn't touched any hallucinogens for several years, but she I guess doubled down on them. I get a message out of the blue from a girl I didn't know saying she knew I had dated my ex and wanted to know if my ex was abusive previously. I guess this girl and my ex were dating, and while tripping on acid my ex snapped and tried to kill this girl. My ex thought she had successfully done so and stole this girl's clothes and ran off, but this girl woke up and called the cops. The girl wanted to know if my ex had a pattern of violence or if maybe it was just a psychotic break. I had to inform this girl that had I not left my ex would have killed me, and I'm so positive of that. Once arrested, my ex started sending this girl letters in prison. They didn't even make sense anymore and most of the letters were manic babbling. I also found out that my ex had gotten so into LSD that all of our old friends in her sorority stopped hanging out with her because they thought she was weird. Super sad. Edit. Clarified some things that other people commented on the copied version of this post. I had a friend develop psychosis from LSD too. Really scary thing to watch. I'm glad you were able to recognize how manipulative she was before you were in too deep. My dad started declining shortly after he received an intense treatment for liver issues from a life of hard drug use and alcoholism. The treatment was successful, and he was very healthy all things considered. But he took the success of the treatment as a sort of permission to continue drinking to excess. He and my mom divorced because of his alcoholism. After they divorced, he was diagnosed with wet brain, which is basically alcohol-induced dementia. He was forced to retire from his job early and began thinking there was a conspiracy between his doctors, my mom and his former employer to ruin his life. He became angry and his overall cognitive condition continued to decline. It was clear he was not doing well, and after further tests it was determined the prior diagnosis was incorrect and he had early onset Alzheimer's. What followed was horrific. He continued to believe there was a conspiracy and he wasn't sick. He refused to admit anything was wrong, even when he began forgetting what my relationship to him was. He knew my name and my face and my husband, but he forgot he was my dad. He was an amazing musician, and towards the end he couldn't play, which was super awful and heartbreaking. Eventually we tried to move him into a care home. After he got sick he moved back with my mom on their property, but it was difficult because of his relatively young age. There were issues with his medicine and he became very aggressive, which made it even harder to find somewhere. The big turning point was when my mom left to go grocery shopping one night, and when she returned he was gone. He was very fit and managed to walk a few miles before he tripped and fell, and someone literally found him in a ditch on the side of the road. That person called an ambulance and we located him in the local hospital. Before that incident he knew my name and my husband's name. He could talk in short, repeated sentences. He never got to go home after that night, and the only facility that would provide care was in a large city 45 minutes away. It wasn't the nicest place either, and is one of the only places that will take difficult patients. My dad wasn't difficult, but he was strong and tall, so he was heavily medicated, which I suspect had to do with an accelerated decline. He couldn't say much more than one sentence or a yeah, or take me home. It was so heartbreaking. He died in that place on Christmas Eve. I'm sure this is buried by now, but this was cathartic. Thank you to anyone who has read this far. Watching him decline was the absolute worst, and I would never wish that on my worst enemy. I miss him so much. My husband going through a serious depression starting last year. He was very angry at me, and I had no idea why. He would jump on me for doing things like dropping a fork. He is in therapy now and not nearly as dark or angry, but at this time last year, I spent a lot of time in another room of our home. If there's one thing I wish depression didn't do, I wished it wouldn't cause serious irritation and anger. I'd get so pissed at the tiniest things I'd punch bruises into my ducking legs. I'm sorry you've had to deal with that. This is my story. When I was 11 my parents divorced. I was a wreck, had no friends, and was constantly sad. Over the years I got worse and worse until at around age 13 I started getting suicidal. By 15 I was having suicidal thoughts on a daily basis. It was bad. I still didn't realize I was depressed somehow. Then at 16 I hurt myself for the first time. That's when I realized something was undeniably wrong. By that time I had friends who I could lean on and a great school, but years of verbal abuse from my mom has taken its toll. So at 16 I started getting therapy. That summer I went to camp, and that was the catalyst for my healing. Over the next year I got better and better until I was no longer depressed. Get it, kid? You're smart to recognize, brilliant for getting help. Trust yourself. You're gonna be wonderful. This might be funny, but it is also serious. Watching the mental unraveling of Donald Trump over the last couple years has been unreal. It's incredibly serious. Watch him speak now, and watch him speak 4 years ago. Severe decline and he still holds the football. Made a friend who was a super cool guy and everyone always wanted to spend time with him, and he was always included. There were so many little things here and there that tipped us off, though, that progressed from apologizing a lot for everything, to being all robotic and lacking any sort of personality, to stalking, to violent mental breakdowns, to death threats and eventually a suicide attempt. Sounds like maybe BPD. Apologizes cause he's afraid you would hate him. Gets robotic cause he doesn't want to say anything and his emotions are in a swing. Stalking cause he's afraid of losing his friends. Mental breakdown when he thinks people have abandoned him, then making death threats cause now he can't handle the perceived abandonment, then is guilt ridden / cry for help, or just so depressed about it all, suicide attempt. A friend of mine ended up in an abusive friendship and never recovered. Said friendship lasted over 6 years. No one could convince him that the other person was terrible to him. He ended up ghosting a lot of people he knew, including me. Last I saw of him, his self-esteem had basically tanked into the negatives. He was second guessing almost every decision he had to make, and was much more reserved. I heard through a mutual friend that he ended up moving away and going to therapy in the end, so I hope he got the help he needed. Maybe he lost faith in people, knowing his previous friendship was a lie. Met some alcohol or drugs people, but the case that surprised me was a public high school male teacher I knew for about 6 years. He was sort of fanatic religious person trying to par as a moderate secular. I noticed something was wrong with him. One day, I went to a Saturday no Cleese computer club day. It was a summer sunny hot day, and I was wearing a plain color no logo cap. He told me I should not be wearing caps because people who wear it instead of formal clothes had psychological problems. I just say okay. 1 year later, at his philosophy club, closed doors and windows and told the students how the evil gay people were trying to control the world. He was very nice at start, was concerned teens stay out of drugs or unwanted premises and community awareness. But eventually got worse. Years later, after I finished high school, I heard their own former friend co-workers agree to get him fired because he was getting worse and coerce students with his religious views in a public school. I think he never got a medical diagnosis. Some religious parents still think he was okay, angry because he got fired. I was also religious myself, kind of moderate, but still got spooked by him. I realized he was not okay. Sad case. I met my now wife in late 2004 and was introduced to her elderly father in early 2005. She's only 3 years older than me, but her father was old enough to be my mother's father. Had kids late in life. When I met him, he was a bit physically frail, but mentally sharp. He'd been a big iron programmer, COBOL, Fortran, mainframe EMBLY, etc. I'm a long-time Unix admin, so we got along very well. He was not a C programmer, I am, but told me he'd met Dennis Ritchie at a few conferences. I introduced him to Parallel, and he thought it was a very interesting language. I joined the Association for Computing Machinery, ACM, because of him. And through him, I met more computing greybirds. He walked his daughter down the aisle for my marriage to her. Alas, he developed Lewy body dementia. He'd forget how to perform actions, like dressing, would lose his train of thought, and forget where he was. Oddly enough, he never forgot people. Never forgot who we were. Even remembered doctors he'd just met the day before, although he couldn't remember why he met them. And then he got a stroke, and could no longer speak. But he could clearly understand us. At the hospital after his stroke he was surrounded by doctors, nurses, my wife, etc. At one point everyone left the room except me. I said, "Hey, $DAD." And he looked at me. I said his name, not dad. How about I sit here quietly by your side, read my book, and leave you the FSCK alone? He raised both thumbs up and gave me a huge smile. He eventually moved in with us, wife and I. I'd read The Economist and the communications of the ACM to him. He'd use hand gestures for me to skip an article, keep reading it, repeat a section, and such. It was absolutely clear he was following my reading. He just couldn't respond. In our final call for the hospital, he wouldn't let the EMT lift him into the stretcher, raised a huge fuss. But he let me lift him, and I was one of his palbearers. During all of this my wife, his daughter, was his greatest champion. She fought every step of the way for him to get the best medical care, watched everything like a hawk, and stood by her father's side through thick and thin. And she says she'll love me forever for gently carrying him in his last moments. At his burial I recited the following eulogy. The results of your process have been printed to standard out. Your process is halted, variables unset, memory deallocated and returned to the heap. You return to init and announce successful exit 0 to the operating system. Now you reside in /usr/bin. where perhaps one day the great sysup will load you into the registers again. End of file. I have a friend who had a stroke a couple years ago. Her recovery has been staggeringly amazing. I've seen the cord scans of her brain and the damage is pretty severe. The doctor did warn us that part of the brain that is damages the adult. Hey, this isn't a great idea part of her brain. It showed up when she thought she could go walk around and tourist the day after surgery when she really should be home in bed. Normally, she would be losing her mind over having a mole burned off, but she was not worried about a super risky vein surgery. Almost all of the time, she seems like her normal self, and I'm impressed as hell as how amazing she is. But every once in a while, she'll come up with something completely nuts, or say something insane. It's kind of weird, because she's really sensitive about her brain damage, so I don't know how to say, "Oh, girl. Pre-stroke you would never suggest this." I have watched as my own mental state has degraded over the past 10 years. Both my parents have health problems. My dad has been permanently disabled since I was a child, and as a result, my mom became mentally unstable. When I graduated high school I was hopeful and tried to balance everything. It took me dropping out of college 2 times to realize just how bad my own mental state has become. I'm now diagnosed with complex PTSD. My mental state is high enough to understand why my dad or mom are the way they are and why they do what they do. But my mental state is so degraded that I can no longer just let my mom say or do whatever she wants. I used to be a huge extrovert and loved making new experiences. After taking care of my dad and mom since I was a child, I'm now incapable of taking care of myself. I do understand that part of the reason for my degraded mental state is due to hypervigilance. I'm always on alert. At any second my dad could have fallen again, and I need to help him up. My mother could be having another mental breakdown and I need to go comfort her. Interestingly, this is why I do not play online games and mainly played single player RPG. Because I can always pause those games or quit without worrying about other players. Something you may not realize about taking care of a loved one is how stressful it is knowing every little action can have a major impact. You cannot get angry and have to always try to de-escalate. If my dad gets angry and yells he can have another heart attack. If I ask my mom to stop verbally abusing me, she breaks down and starts crying. To me, the worst part is not knowing how long it will be like this. Neither are terminally ill. Both my parents are a ticking time bomb. They can live another 30 years or drop dead tomorrow. The older I get, the worse my mental state becomes. I have to balance what is best for me and what is best for my parents' health. A few years ago I would have said it is hard but possible. Now, I know it is impossible, because my mental state is inversely proportional to time spent taking care of my parents. Tidbits about my mental state. The sound of running bath water sends me into fight or flight mode. I swear I hear someone crying every single time. Then I remember how, when I was a kid I would run a bath or take a shower and my mom would have an unrelated breakdown and would be crying or yelling somewhere in the house. My mom lives in an alternate reality where she is always the victim and nothing is her fault. So growing up my mom would constantly say I remembered things wrong or that X never happened. So I get triggered when someone lies to me or says you remembered it wrong. On the bright side I have an amazing memory when it comes to people. You need to get out of that house. You need to live your own life. You need to ensure your own well-being and your own oxygen supply before you do others. Just like they instruct you on a plane. You have done what you can for your parents. You need to allow them to find another way. You cannot take care of them if doing so slowly kills you. My grandfather was a wonderful painter. He did it professionally for decades, even won some national awards for graphic design. He was diagnosed with dementia. Someone had commissioned a painting. He was still just as proud, but it was just awful. The face was twisted and distorted like a kid's drawing. Colors made no sense. Shadows were painted with pink. It was heartbreaking. My sister's mental state deteriorated rather rapidly, in my opinion. She would put her laundry in the washer and 2 hours later be complaining that someone stole all her clothing as she couldn't find them. She'd go shopping and leave her purchases in a shopping cart just outside the door while she got her car. Then she'd drive home and later wonder where all her purchases were. These are just a couple of examples that I'm comfortable relating here. Her husband finally took her to a clinic to be evaluated. She was referred to a psychiatrist who recommended hospitalization for her. She spent the rest of her brief life after that in a state mental hospital. I visited her there, but was so dismayed by the conditions there with patients in various states of confusion that I kept my visits very brief. I thought she had finally gotten some peace when she died. At the very least she wasn't constantly in a state of confusion and worry. My dad got cancer a few years back. He hated himself for being sick and for putting our family through it. We didn't mind. But we saw what as a vulnerable, scared man he was, and he told us that didn't want to die, and he would cry about dying because of my mum. He would beg me, as a 15-year-old, to look after my mum and sister like he never could. It was ducking hard. It was sad to see my strong dad end up like the rest of us, scared and weak. He came through it, fought and survived. He lived his last 4 years happy and cancer free. He dropped dead in front of me after a heart attack a couple weeks ago when I was 23. I'm grateful he died not knowing he was going to die and lived the life he wanted to, because by hell it would have killed me more than it did him to watch him waste away from cancer. I'm so sorry. Moved into a basement unit below a nice dude. We'd talk and hang out occasionally. He started getting a bit weird with conspiracy theories, but we were like whatever floats your boat. Started hearing conspiracy theory radio through the air vents at night. He started pushing stranger and stranger theories throughout the year. When we moved out he was doing straight up exorcisms in the room above our kitchen. We could hear big on evil demon being shouted and burning sage through the vents. Apparently a neighbor called the cops and they just asked him to shut the window, lol. Did he get the demon out though? My dad has been an intense alcoholic for the better part of 40 years. I had always kept him at arm's length, just because of the difficulty of a childhood of being raised by a raging alcoholic. I love him, but our past is difficult. I'd call him, or swing by once a month, unless something else was up, medical issues, holidays, help with something, etc. Close bracket. A few years back, my sister and some other family had voiced concern that he was alone and going too far. Sure enough, he was back to regularly binging on cheap whiskey and his memory was so shot he was forgetting to eat and take his insulin. He was at the beginning stage of alcoholic dementia. The next year was me babysitting him and checking on him throughout the week, trying to help him remember his insulin, helping him shop, getting him to eat, trying to get home to stop drinking. After 3 trips to the ER, which all 3 resulted in at least a week stay, and failing to not stop drinking each time, my power of attorney was enacted, and we had to find a long-term care facility for him. Due to his bad habits and mental decline, his once amazing credit was smashed, and he was broke, so we had to get him on our state's Medicaid system, which involved liquidating what he had, not much, thankfully. He was officially diagnosed. At the beginning of his stay, he couldn't remember things from just 30 minutes prior. After 4 months, we weren't even sure if his dementia was unstoppable, let alone reversible. About 4 months into 2019, improvements were seen. He was moved out of the memory ward and in with the regular residents and has improved, but still at this point isn't in any shape to live on his own again. That's before his existing medical debt is taken into consideration. Alcohol ducking sucks, and alcoholism is a nightmare. If you don't die from general stupidity, or your liver, or your pancreas, then your brain turns into a pickle. Treat your body and mind right, don't pass the consequences of your addictions down to your kids or loved ones. I had a neighbor who was a trans woman on her mental meds, but back to bill off the meds. They were a sweet person. When they would go off the meds they would become a totally different person though, and the schizophrenia would really eat at them. Miss you, Billy. I had this friend in year 8 who had just came out as transgender. She wanted to be male. First to me as her trusted friend a few months before, and I didn't know what it was. She explained and told her that she was still my friend, no matter her gender. This for her was a real confidence boost, so when September came around, she was now Levi, but, being as teenagers are, they were all horrible to him. And me being the only accepting one, I stood by him to see him get sadder, angrier and by November, suicidal. to the point when over the Christmas break he was admitted to a mental hospital and he never came back to our school just because of the freaking students not accepting her. I see this dude every day. I can tell he's going downhill and quick, but anything I've ever tried to tell him gets ignored. Also, I only see him in the mirror, cause it's me. And you know how the best advice you have for others, but don't take yourself. Yeah, it's like that. Hey man, just because you feel you're going downhill doesn't mean there's not an uphill after. If you need someone to talk to, please don't hesitate to come and hit up my DMs. Try your best to look up. You got this. Well, I'm dying anyway and my family have said I've become way more depressing lately. Try your best to stay positive, dude. I read your posts on r/amithyhole, and I'm sorry you're going through all of this. Just try to relax and live the life you have left to the fullest. You're an amazing father, and your son will grow up knowing that. Spend time doing you love, and try to take your mind off of what's to come. I'm rooting for ya, dude. I was walking from clan to clan in the halls one day at school and my friend S ran up to me crying. She dragged me into the bathroom and locked us in the biggest stall and proceeded to have a complete breakdown in front of me, almost screaming that she didn't know what was wrong with her and she needed to go to a hospital and she felt like she was dying. I switched between just holding her and telling her it was all gonna be okay and giving her as much space as I could while she panicked and threw her arms around. I had her dial her mom's number on her phone and give it to me. I explained to her mom she needed to go to a psychiatric hospital and she got picked up. She was in school the next day and back to normal. She thanked me for helping her and she's still one of my best friends to this day, although the breakdowns didn't stop. Sounds like a severe panic attack. I know the feeling all too well and have been in similar situations. Panic attacks are hell and you really do feel like you're completely out of control and dying. I had them so much growing up and literally had them every waking second of the day outside of a couple of minutes a day for a month and a half straight when my mental state finally broke. I hope that eventually she'll be able to find what works for her and helps her and at least decrease the amount of them. If you're still close with her, I'd be happy to share with you some of the things that helped me get out of panic attacks. I learned skills in therapy and one in particular works incredibly well with near instant results. One of my close friends was a wild kid. She didn't do drugs, but she drank like a truck driver. We went partying every day, fun girl to be around. Amazing girl and very insightful. She was bisexual, and when she came out to her mother reacted rather badly. I saw her get sadder every day. She began dating this guy she didn't really feel attracted to. She was in love with a girl. I didn't see her much, but whenever I did, it was clear that wasn't the girl I knew. We got together because she told me she was incredibly sad. I thought we would go drinking, but we just sat on a bench talking. She told me she thought she would go crazy. We didn't see each other or talk for some time. Some months passed by, and she writes me that she's sorry. She was in the hospital for an attempted suicide. I saw the pictures of it. They were gruesome. Some other time peas, and she writes me that she wants to meet up. She waits for us on the beach with a box of beer, open arms, the girl I met. I had a hard time making friends even in college. But there was a girl who was a bit different who liked to sit next to me in class and we would often hang out around and get lunch together. She would talk a lot about kind of boring things and honestly, sometimes it was a little annoying, but she was my friend, so it was okay. Total nerd. I was too. One week I started getting worried about her. She said she hadn't slept all night. Then she said that a few days in a row. One day she said she was up all night talking to God with a really excited expression. In class, the professor would be in the middle of lecturing and she would turn to me and talk about something, full volume, really excitedly. Eventually, buried, I had to whisper, "Hey, we're in the middle of class and I think the teacher can hear you. Can we talk about this later?" She burst into tears and ran out of the room. After that, I didn't see her for a really long time. She disappeared and no one knew what had happened. At first we thought we should call the police, but then someone relented that her mother had come and picked her up. She was just a few doors down from my dorm room. I went to her door a few times and knocked and tried to peek through. Her turquoise curtains were still up, I could see, but I knew she wasn't there. Still, she would be back sometime, I was sure, to get her curtains. So I put some flowers in a vase and left them by her door with a note that we missed her and loved her and were praying for her. I had to change the flowers 3 times because they died and no one had shown up to clean her room. Eventually, the flowers disappeared and she never came back to school. She wouldn't answer any texts or messages. I saw her maybe 2 years later at a wedding. She looked happy but didn't seem the same, and her mother was right by her side the whole time, not going far. I still don't know what really happened, but I think she might have developed a psychological disorder, like schizophrenia. Both physical and mental stage. Last December my grandmother was put in hospice for a brain tumor. The first day she seemed fine, a very healthy individual for someone 70 years old. A few days later she started to show signs of dementia. Her face seemed to become more agedy and crooked and her hairline was receding. Eventually she couldn't see, not 100% blind but blurry vision, but her hearing was somehow impeccable. Eventually she stopped eating and drinking, and she couldn't breathe, and she died about 2 weeks in. Afterwards I developed a huge fear of death, witnessing my grandmother just deteriorate each day, and seeing her body give up on the needs of eat and drink because it knows it's dying, is what scares me. I have trouble sleeping at night thinking we all just exist to die. Either way of death, the thought of our organs just dying off cell by cell, killing us, scares me. I even get shocked thinking about it, how fast she just deteriorated and died. If I ever die of a terminal thing, I want them to put me on medicine and kill me when I pass out. I don't want to be put in a bed and be told I only have a few days left. Also I'll listen to the caretakers everywhere at the end of time. That just does not help. Myself. Not sure if that counts. The moment I realized that something was wrong, I recorded every instance where depression hit me hard. I started it 1 year ago and still write in it, but reading it is like watching someone go mad. The person I was then is far from the person I'm now. Me. I have gaps in my memory and loss of memory. I lose trail of thoughts and can't think of the simplest word, even if I was just talking about moments before. I can't remember the day or date, always looking at my phone. Conversations I have with people, I cannot recall or even remember having them. My husband is a patient man. Topics I committed to memory, the 6 main extermination camps for instance, I cannot recall. I can remember 4 of them. There is no disease that I'm aware of and no trauma that I recall that would affect me like this. I'm relatively young, mid-30s. It's a slow thing, but also I'm very aware of the decline. The decline makes me feel so dumb and like a simpleton. Sorry, never really told anyone publicly. Please see someone for an easement such as a neurologist, neuropsychiatrist, neuropsychologist and preferably all 3. Get a diagnosis and get support. His friend was good at a lot of things, and he had schizophrenia, so he slowly convinced himself that he couldn't do anything. My aunt and uncle. Not mental but drug related, most likely meth and crank. We were neighbors and our houses were separated by some woods. They got beyond paranoid. It started out with small things like cops driving by the house all the time. Then it grew to cops and ATF were hiding in our woods watching them. Then they were being filmed. BC cops had put cameras in their house. When our dog disappeared for a while they were adamant that the police or ATF took her for ransom. They destroyed a beautiful 2-story home by shooting the walls and even their TV. They could see someone inside of it watching them. Spoiler, it was their reflection, with shotguns. They shot through their own bed and called us panicking. BC a woman was hiding under their bed refusing to let their little chihuahua come out to them, but you couldn't see her. BC she was holding onto the slats. They got clean for a few years, but eventually the habit came back, only this time my aunt had in her sleep. Duck meth. My mom was very warm, positive, popular, and social. She raised us as a single mom, and even though we were very poor and living through war and a nasty divorce, she maintained her positive outlook and would happily share whatever we have with neighbors and family. She had Alzheimer's at 65 and would say that people in the TV are conspiring against her / talking to her. She once told me that the guy on TV is flirting with her and she feels uncomfortable. Another time she was really afraid that people on TV were trying to accuse her of murder. She got much worse very quickly in her drive. Said that early Alzheimer onset is usually more aggressive. She would always mention her village and refer to all places by her village names. A while after her close friend died she stopped talking and would only hum, and she passed away 3 years back. It was a very hard experience losing her a little by little over 5 years, and it made me think a lot about who are we without our memory. She had these empty looks, lost her warmth and compassion, thought everyone was after her except for me and a couple of close family and friends. Getting a message from my best friend saying they'd attempted to take their own life broke my heart instantly. We always talk about our issues, but one night, she messaged me saying that she took pills. She said she didn't know why she did it. Shattered me completely. I had a long talk with her, explained to her that her happiness is out there and that it was waiting for her. Broke me into pieces, because at the time, I felt as though I couldn't really do anything, if you get what I mean. But I'm glad she's doing better now. My grandmother passed away in March due to her second round of cancer. My family and I would visit her every weekend. She lives 2 hours away. Every time we would visit her she would get weaker and weaker, and I was literally watching her deteriorate. She would not eat or get up to walk around, which caused her to die. I was so angry at the time because she didn't want to try. Mom and I visited her on a Friday in 2 hours. After we got to the nursing home she died. I watched her take her last breath. It was heartbreaking, but weird. I knew she didn't want to fight cancer anymore, so it was also relief for my mom. It was so much stress on her. While we were there, before she died, the only words she said was "I'm ready," and I'm ready to leave. She knew she was going to die. I miss her so much, and I hope she is resting peacefully. She died 2.5 months after her cancer diagnosis. It was very fast, and my grandfather, my dad's dad, died a month before her, and my great grandmother died 3 months before him. So 2020 has been rough for me and my family. I'm only 15. I watched myself deteriorate without even knowing it. I was 12 at the time and had been sexually, physically, and emotionally abused by my father my entire life. My mom had done nothing. I remember her acting as though everything was fine. I was a very happy child. I used to have what my teachers called laughing fits, where I would just laugh at nothing for half an hour or more. I remember a year later being shocked after my friend told me that their father didn't grab them in sexual places and that their father didn't break dishes and yell. I think that was the first time I realized something was wrong. My friends were my lifeline, and through thick and thin, they were there. Through my father's outbursts and sexual assaults, they stood by me. They stood by me as I smiled less and became more isolated. I would sit in my room alone and cry. I wouldn't talk to people for days. People became more distant, and I started acting out toward my family and friends. Then another year later my dad told me we were moving away from the only thing I had left, my friends. It was for my father's job. I completely lost myself. I was self-harming, having suicidal thoughts, and isolating myself. I tried to kill myself a few months after that. I hung myself in the bathroom, and if it wasn't for my mom who had forgotten her phone in there, I wouldn't be here today. I got help afterward, but it didn't help much, as a year after that I found myself in a toxic friend group that bullied me to the brink. That was the day of the California fires. We lost our house and our belongings. I lost my friends, and I had nobody. It was my mom who also realized the extent of my father's abuse and left him. I look back on it now and realize just how impactful my childhood was, and I think about my younger self and how she may have grown up, but she never had the fun childhood most children do. I regret that. This was 3 years ago. 2 years ago I cut contact with my dad, saying that unless he admitted and owned up to everything he did to me and my mother, I would never talk to him again. It was 2 weeks ago he decided to once again say that it wasn't true and my mom and I were lying. I cut all contact from him. It sucks to not have a father. Father's Day proved this to me. I'm 16 ATM, and I'm just now really starting to heal. Deleted. My own, I used to be so happy with not a care in the world, then I started to mature more. and I loved to a much more harsh area, and the toxic people made me extremely anxious. If I'm not with friends and the rude people slowly chopped away at my self-esteem to the point where sometimes I think about the stuff I have said to myself, and I'm just in awe. BTW, I'm sorry if this offends anyone. I know that there will be much more serious comments here, but I just wanted to share this. Don't be sorry, I'm like you, but trying to see the best out of life. I too matured way too fast, had to be the grown up when I was a kid. My self-esteem is pretty much gone, but trying to see the sunshine every once in a while, and I hope you do too. Take care of yourself. It happened to me, and I can't remember. Cheers. I'm better now. Does watching Joe Biden count? You can see Biden's dementia live on TV if you live in the States. I feel bad for the guy watching him from the other side of the world, getting worse every time I see him in a video. He won't last another 3 years. Does he have trouble drinking from a glass using only one hand? Some people say that's a short sign. My dad had manuscript. He had many lesions in the frontal lobe. He developed OCD, and at the end he was basically experiencing signs of dementia. I took care of him after my mother left, and he would always ask me to take him to his girlfriend's house. He was referring to a girl in his youth. He just had so many problems. It was so terrible. I'm an American who has been watching national news about my president for the last couple of years. Me, not nearly as severe as some other people, but I dropped out of high school due to mental issues, and they still have not gotten better. I'm on a pension, but I'm so damn tired. I live with people who I hate who make my issues worse. I'm too poor to go to a psychiatrist. Thankfully I have a psychologist. I'm a shut-in most of the time. I'm at the point where I'm losing my hair to stress. It's only a bald spot, but I'm only 22. My ex. When we met, they were funny as hell, smart as hell, had a lot of friends, and was well liked. I was drawn to them immediately and fell in love pretty quickly too. However, after almost a year of knowing them, and after being together for a few months, something changed. Something triggered them, and to this day I'm not sure what. Barriers in their mind came down, and suddenly we both found out, together, that they had dissociative identity disorder as a result of some pretty horrific child abuse. It can actually only be caused by horrific childhood trauma. Then the PTSD symptoms came, not just from them, but from the alters had been hiding all those years too. They went from this bubbly and happy person with so much light and potential inside of them, to a ghost with no motivation and hardly any happiness. Spent every day in a haze. Jumpy all the time. Terrified even, often staring into space, and frozen from the flashbacks that would overcome them. I got to meet and build friendships with some of their alters, but it was just so sad to know that their very existence was the result of something so horrible. But they just lost their spark. They didn't have any life inside of them anymore. Even their eyes constantly looked dull and dead, except for the times when they were filled with pure terror. We broke up for completely unrelated reasons, but I still often hope that one day they can get the help they need and live the life they deserve. Because they are a special one in a duck-in-million type person and don't deserve the cards they were dealt. They, and every alter they have, deserve happiness and peace. I worked with a girl, we'll call her N. At first she was polite, a little quirky and odd, but generally kept to herself. She sat in the cubicle across from me, so I couldn't see her, but I could hear her. The first weird things were the laughing/crying. I could hear her, but couldn't ever tell if she was cracking up at something, or crying because she was upset. N would do this every few days at first, then it started happening every day, then multiple times per day. Things progressed and she started spitting into her garbage can, very loudly, every few minutes. She was a vegetarian who ate pretty healthy, and at this point she's eating Burger King chicken sandwiches. I'm not sure if she was gagging and spitting into her garbage, or what. I started listening to music at that point, and let my supervisor know about the weird things going on because, even though I was annoyed, I was actually worried about her. I spoke to her but nothing really came from it. Then N started dancing. People would walk by, and she'd be in her cube just dancing away, and if anyone asked her if she was okay she would say the weather is so nice today. So now, this is maybe 3 weeks after the laughing/crying started. She's completely lost her chews. She starts eating hand sanitizer. Yes, eating it, because it kills the germs inside her. Other people started going to ours and they pulled Den into a conference room one day after a particularly bad episode of spitting, dancing, hysterical laughing/crying, and told her to take a couple days of vacation and come back the following week. She freaks out, starts swearing at the lady from ours, and tells the lady to go F / herself. And gets fired, and as she's walking out the our lady is trying to get the office keys from her. N doesn't hand them over and instead gets in her car and leaves. The lady from ours says N tried to run her over. I have no idea if that actually happened or not. Regardless, our office got locked down the rest of the day and rekeyed overnight. It doesn't end there. N shows up the next day like nothing happened wearing a ball gown. She's escorted off and no one has heard from her since. I google her name every now and then to see if anything pops up, but nothing ever does. My dad is bipolar too. For my whole life growing up he was semi-zonked out on lithium and basically a rick all the time. He told me a few years ago that he was such a big rick because literally the only emotion he could feel was anger and frustration, so he would intentionally create conflict just to feel something. Anyway, I was 16 and he started getting back into his art, taking some time off from the business he built and runs and spending most of his days painting and drawing in his studio. He is a talented mixed media artist with several advanced degrees in watercolors, printmaking, etc. Around that time he started playing certain songs over and over again really loudly in his studio. Then he started playing the same songs really loudly on the kitchen stereo. Eventually people would come over for dinner and he would just start blasting the same song on repeat so that no one could even hear each other or say anything. One day I was playing baseball in the backyard when my dad stuck his entire body out the attic window and shouted at me in a very serious way if I knew any attorneys and not to talk to the police or the FBI if anyone asked about him. This is around the time I clued into the fact that something was wrong. I remember shouting back at him that I did not know any attorneys because I was 16, and then immediately wondering how this would not be immediately obvious to anyone, especially my own father. Things finally spiraled out of control when he stopped working or leaving the house and just stayed in his studio in his underwear all day. I probably shouldn't say this as it might encourage people to embrace their manic episodes, but the art he made during this period is legitimately some of the best work I have ever seen someone I actually know produce. It was wild and intense and full of crazy images that made me think for hours. He started messing with the house's alarm system every couple of minutes, just punching random numbers into it non-stop for hours, like he was hacking some sort of code. Eventually the alarm went off and the police came to the house. When they came he was wearing nothing except for a t-shirt. He picked up our dog, put her under his arm, and ran down the street screaming crazy like a fox. He was actually laughing, and it seemed like he was having a really fun time. The police put him on involuntary psychiatric hold and I didn't see him again for 2 months. My mom told me and my brother that we couldn't go see him at the hospital because more often than not he was strapped down to a backboard and screaming violent nonsense. When he got home he was all drugged up and terribly depressed. He barely moved, his hands shook, and he slurred his words, but usually what he said didn't make any sense anyway. He still spent a lot of time in his studio, but mostly just painted over the same canvas in gray tones of green or sepia without actually adding anything meaningful to the piece. It took him almost a year to get back to his old righead self. Happy ending to this story is that psychiatry and pharmacology have made huge advances since the year 2000 and now he takes meds that don't obliterate all his positive feelings and sees a therapist that specializes in artists with bipolar 2. He is almost a completely different person now and also probably my best friend. Also makes great art every day but still manages to work and not have the police come for him ever. From 2016 to present I've watched the President of the United States lose his mental state, and every day it only gets crazier. I've been watching Biden over the past several months and it's obvious his mental capacities are degrading. I don't know why you're being downvoted lol. Compare his vice presidential debates to his debates today. Huge difference. My mom has always been off. Granted, her grandmother and mom both had bipolar, and considering I do too, I doubt it skipped her. However, she didn't ever fall apart until I was 12. That's when my grandparents passed away. Her whole world shattered, and she sunk into a deep depression. Now I'm not sure if it was clinical depression or her just taking a nosedive into severe depression cycles. She quit caring about basic things and being irrationally emotional about others. She lashed out physically and verbally at anyone that rocked her boat. She started hoarding animals and stopped picking up after herself, and my stepdad obviously wasn't going to do it/s. My brother saw it as his chance to never do chores again. Suddenly we were living in filth. Bugs crawling out of every crevice, trash and dirty clothes and blankets piled everywhere, animal waste all over the house. Fleas filled the carpet. I ended up keeping a bottle of flea spray with me and hosing down my legs and clothes every time I ventured out of my room. I didn't trust any of the food to be uncontaminated, so I got a $10 microwave at a garage sale down the street and kept a small Rubbermaid bin with cans of raviolis and soup in my room. This lasted with her until I was probably 23 to 24. She only cleaned up a bit and got rid of animals because she was forced to. She seemed to be doing better these last few years, but has started backsliding, especially with the animals. I'm just waiting for the phone call when they get thrown out of their rent house. It's only a matter of time. FYI, she refuses any mention of psychological help, and my stepdad enables her behavior because it keeps her from leaving him and allows him to get away with his spending habits. Throwaway account time. Due to legal reasons, I isn't that bad as some as the others, but if not more cringe and angry than anything. Had a friend in school who was from Serbia, live in Northwest US, and we were good friends. We hung out once because his parents were pretty strict, but talked and got along well for a school year. He was pretty well behaved and not a jerk was to anyone. Pretty much hanged out with his friends and did school's work and called it a day. We got moved around and didn't see him as much after that year. The year after that, he had associated himself with a group with some bad rep for being disruptive and downright jackies. He immediately spiraled into bad behavior and bullying to the point the kid had enough and threatened to break into his house and commit arson. Obviously a bluff, but was pretty angry. Ended up going to jail for drug charges and a load of other things, including assault with a deadly weapon. Would have been attempted murder, but got a plea on the kid he was bullying. Asked a friend what happened. Kid had a knife, and while said bullied kid was walking home, stabbed him with his goon friends and beat the crap out of him. Cop just happens to be driving by just as they run away. If the cop had gotten there about 5 minutes later, the kid would have died from blood loss and a punctured lung and other internal injuries. Sad to the poor bullied kid get harmed like that. Also sad to see a good kid go spiraling down to end up committing assault with a deadly weapon. I will try to answer as many questions as I can. Oh my, you watched until the end? That's fucking awesome, dude. Thanks for watching.